The Wonder Book of Bible Stories by Logan Marshall. Chapter 22. The Story of Jesus, Part 2. The Story of the Water that was turned into Wine. A few days after Jesus met his followers or disciples at the river Jordan, he came with these men to a town in Galilee called Cana to be present at a wedding. In those lands a feast was always held at a wedding, and often the friends of those who were married stayed several days, eating and drinking together. The mother of Jesus was at this wedding as a friend of the family, for Nazareth, where she lived, was quite near to Cana. Before the wedding feast was over, all the wine had been used, and there was no more for the guests to drink. The mother of Jesus knew that her son had power to do whatever he chose, and she said to him, "They have no wine." Jesus said to her, "O woman, what have I to do with thee? My hour is not yet come." But his mother knew that Jesus would in some way help the people in their need, and she said to the servants who were waiting at the table, "Whatever he tells you to do, be sure to do it." In the dining hall were standing 6 large stone jars, each about as large as a barrel, holding 25 gallons. These jars held water for washing, as the Jews washed their hands before every meal, and washed their feet as often as they came from walking in the street, since they wore no shoes, but only sandals. Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water." The servants obeyed Jesus and filled the jars up to the brim. Then Jesus spoke to them again and said, "Now draw out some of the water, and take it to the ruler of the feast." They drew out water from the jars, and saw that it had been turned into wine. The ruler did not know from what place the wine had come, but he said to the young man who had just been married, the bridegroom, "At a feast everybody gives his best wine at the beginning, and afterward, when his guests have drunk freely, he brings on wine that is not so good. But you have kept the good wine until now." This was the first time that Jesus used the power that God had given him to do what no other man could do. Such works as these were called miracles, and Jesus did them as signs of his power as the Son of God. When the disciples saw this miracle, they believed in Jesus more fully than before. After this, Jesus went with his mother and his younger brothers to a place called Capernaum, on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. But they stayed there only a few days, for the feast of the Passover was near, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem to attend it. You remember that the feast of the Passover was held every year, to keep in mind how God had led the people of Israel out of Egypt long before. When Jesus came to Jerusalem, he found in the courts of the temple men who were selling oxen and sheep and doves for the sacrifices, and other men sitting at tables changing the money of Jews who came from other lands into the money of Judea. All this made the courts around the temple seem like a market, and not a place for the worship of God. Jesus picked up some cord and made from it a little whip. With it he began to drive out of the temple all the buyers and sellers. He was but one, and they were many, but such power was in his look that they ran before him. He drove the men and the sheep and the oxen, he overturned the tables and threw on the floor the money, and to those who were selling the doves he said, "Take these things away. Make not my Father's house a house for selling and buying." The acts of Jesus were not pleasing to the rulers of the Jews, for many of them were making money by this selling of sacrifices and changing of money. Some of the rulers came to Jesus and said to him, "What right have you to come here and do such things as these? What sign can you show that God has given to you power to rule in this place?" Jesus said to them, "I will give you a sign. Destroy this house of God, and in 3 days I will raise it up." Then said the Jews, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and it's not finished yet. Will you raise it up in 3 days?" But Jesus did not mean that temple on Mount Moriah. He was speaking of himself, for in him God was dwelling as in a temple, and he meant that when they should put him to death, he would rise again in 3 days. Afterward, when Jesus had died and risen again, his followers, the disciples, thought of what he had said and understood these words. The story of the stranger at the well. While Jesus was teaching in Jerusalem and in the country places near it, John the Baptist was still preaching and baptizing. But already the people were leaving John and going to hear Jesus. Some of the followers of John the Baptist were not pleased, as they saw that fewer people came to their master, and that the crowds were seeking Jesus. But John said to them, "I told you that I am not the Christ, but that I am sent before him. Jesus is the Christ, the King. He must grow greater, while I must grow less, and I am glad that it is so." Soon after this, Herod Antipas, the king of the province or land of Galilee, put John in prison. Herod had taken for his wife a woman named Herodias, who had left her husband to live with Herod, which was very wicked. John sent word to Herod that it was not right for him to have this woman as his wife. These words of John made Herodias very angry. She hated John and tried to kill him. Herod himself did not hate John so greatly, for he knew that John had spoken the truth. But he was weak, and yielded to his wife Herodias. To please her, he sent John the Baptist to a lonely prison among the mountains east of the Dead Sea, for the land in that region, as well as Galilee, was under Herod's rule. There, in prison, Herod hoped to keep John safe from the hate of his wife Herodias. Soon after John the Baptist was thrown into prison, Jesus left the country near Jerusalem with his disciples, and went toward Galilee, the province in the north. Between Judea in the south and Galilee in the north lay the land of Samaria, where the Samaritans lived, who hated the Jews. They worshipped the Lord as the Jews worshipped him, but they had their own temple and their own priests. And they had their own Bible, which was only the 5 books of Moses, for they would not read the other books of the Old Testament. The Jews and the Samaritans would scarcely ever speak to each other, so great was the hate between them. When Jews went from Galilee to Jerusalem, or from Jerusalem to Galilee, they would not pass through Samaria, but went down the mountains to the river Jordan and walked beside the river, in order to go around Samaria. But Jesus, when he would go from Jerusalem to Galilee, walked over the mountains straight through Samaria. One morning, while he was on his journey, he stopped to rest beside an old well at the foot of Mount Gerizim, not far from the city of Shechem, but nearer to a little village that was called Sychar. This well had been dug by Jacob, the great father or ancestor of the Israelites, many hundreds of years before. It was an old well then in the days of Jesus, and it is much older now, for the same well may be seen in that place still. Even now travelers may have a drink from Jacob's well. It was early in the morning, about sunrise, when Jesus was sitting by Jacob's well. He was very tired, for he had walked a long journey. He was hungry, and his disciples had gone to the village near at hand to buy food. He was thirsty, too, and as he looked into the well he could see the water 100 feet below, but he had no rope with which to let down a cup or a jar to draw up some water to drink. Just at this moment a Samaritan woman came to the well, with her water jar upon her head and her rope in her hand. Jesus looked at her, and in one glance read her soul and saw all her life. He knew that Jews did not often speak to Samaritans, but he said to her, "Please to give me a drink." The woman saw from his looks and his dress that he was a Jew, and she said to him, "How is it that you, who are a Jew, ask drink of me, a Samaritan woman?" Jesus answered her, "If you knew what God's free gift is, and if you knew who it is that says to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would ask him to give you living water, and he would give it to you." There was something in the words and the looks of Jesus which made the woman feel that he was not a common man. She said to him, "Sir, you have nothing to draw water with, and the well is deep. Where can you get that living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob, who drank from this well, and who gave it to us?" "Whoever drinks of this water," said Jesus, "shall thirst again. But whoever drinks of the water that I shall give him shall never thirst. But the water that I shall give him shall be in him a well of water springing up unto everlasting life." "Sir," said the woman, "give me some of this water of yours, so that I will not thirst any more, nor come all the way to this well." Jesus looked at the woman and said to her, "Go home, and bring your husband, and come here." "I have no husband," answered the woman. "Yes," said Jesus, "you have spoken the truth. You have no husband. But you have had 5 husbands, and the man whom you now have is not your husband." The woman was filled with wonder as she heard this. She saw that here was a man who knew what others could not know. She felt that God had spoken to him, and she said, "Sir, I see that you are a prophet of God. Tell me whether our people or the Jews are right. Our fathers have worshipped on this mountain. The Jews say that Jerusalem is the place where men should go to worship. Now, which of these is the right place?" "Woman, believe me," said Jesus, "there is coming a time when men shall worship God in other places besides on this mountain and in Jerusalem. The time is near, it has even now come, when the true worshippers everywhere shall pray to God in spirit and in truth, for God himself is a spirit." The woman said, "I know that the Anointed One is coming, the Christ. When he comes, he will teach us all things." Jesus said to her, "I that speak to you now am he, the Christ." Just at this time the disciples of Jesus came back from the village. They wondered to see Jesus talking with the Samaritan woman, but they said nothing. The woman had come to draw water, but in her interest in this wonderful stranger she forgot her errand. Leaving her water jar, she ran back to her village and said to the people, "Come, see a man who told me everything that I have done in all my life. Is not this man the Christ whom we are looking for?" Soon the woman came back to the well with many of her people. They asked Jesus to come to their town and to stay there and teach them. He went with them and stayed there 2 days teaching the people who were Samaritans. And many of the people in that place believed in Jesus and said, "We have heard for ourselves. Now we know that this is indeed the Savior of the world." The story of the fishermen. When Jesus began to teach the people by the river Jordan, a few young men came to him as followers, or disciples. Some of these men were Andrew and John, Peter and Philip, and Nathanael. While Jesus was teaching near Jerusalem and in Samaria, these men stayed with Jesus. But when he came to Galilee, they went to their homes and work, for most of them were fishermen from the Sea of Galilee. One morning, soon after Jesus came to Capernaum, he went out of the city by the sea, followed by a great throng of people who had come together to see him and to hear him. On the shore were lying 2 fishing boats, one of which belonged to Simon and Andrew, the other to James and John and their father Zebedee. The men themselves were not in the boats, but were washing their nets near by. Jesus stepped into the boat that belonged to Simon Peter and his brother Andrew, and asked them to push it out a little into the lake, so that he could talk to the people from it without being crowded too closely. They pushed it out, and then Jesus sat in the boat and spoke to the people as they stood upon the beach. After he had finished speaking to the people and had sent them away, he said to Simon Peter, "Put out into the deep water and let down your nets to catch some fish." "Master," said Simon, "we have been fishing all night and have caught nothing. But if it is your will, I will let down the net again." They did as Jesus bade them, and now the net caught so many fishes that Simon and Andrew could not pull it up, and it was in danger of breaking. They made signs to the 2 brothers, James and John, who were in the other boat, for them to come and help them. They came and lifted the net and poured out the fish. There were so many of them that both the boats were filled and began to sink. When Simon Peter saw this, he was struck with wonder, and felt that it was by the power of God. He fell down at the feet of Jesus, saying, "O Lord, I am full of sin, and am not worthy of all this. Leave me, O Lord." But Jesus said to Simon and to the others, "Fear not, but follow me, and I will make you from this time fishers of men." From that time these 4 men, Simon and Andrew, James and John, gave up their nets and their work and became disciples of Jesus. On the Sabbath after this, Jesus and his disciples went together to the synagogue and spoke to the people. They listened to him and were surprised at his teaching, for while the scribes always repeated what other scribes had said before, Jesus never spoke of what the men of old time had taught, but spoke in his own name and by his own power, saying, "I say unto you," as one who had the right to speak. Men felt that Jesus was speaking to them as the voice of God. On one Sabbath, while Jesus was preaching, a man came into the synagogue who had in him an evil spirit, for sometimes evil spirits came into men and lived in them and spoke out from them. The evil spirit in this man cried out, saying, "Let us alone, thou Jesus of Nazareth. What have we to do with thee? Hast thou come to destroy us? I know thee, and I know who thou art, the Holy One of God." Then Jesus spoke to the evil spirit in the man. "Be still, and come out of this man." Then the evil spirit threw the man down, and seemed as if it would tear him apart. But he left the man lying on the ground without harm. Then wonder fell upon all the people. They were filled with fear, and said, "What mighty word is this? This man speaks even to the evil spirits, and they obey him." After the meeting in the synagogue, Jesus went into the house where Simon Peter lived. There he saw lying upon a bed the mother of Simon's wife, who was very ill with a burning fever. He stood over her and touched her hand. At once the fever left her. She rose up from her bed and waited upon them. At sunset the Sabbath day was over, and then they brought to Jesus from all parts of the city those who were sick, and some that had evil spirits in them. Jesus laid his hands upon the sick, and they became well. He drove out the evil spirits by a word, and would not allow them to speak. End of chapter 22. Recording by Maggie Travers.